Welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. I'm your host, Roshan and I have with me today Deepa Bachu, who is a senior design and strategy leader. She's the partner and CEO of Pensaar Design, a strategy consulting firm that helps businesses with design and innovation. Deepa led product and design teams at Intuit and Merrill Lynch earlier. We're going to be talking to her about how design has evolved over the years, its importance to founders and startups, and how designers can stay relevant in the time to come. So, without further ado, welcome to the podcast, Deepa. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure, Roshan.
Right. So, maybe to begin things, you could take us through a bit about your journey and how the relevance of design has evolved over the last 2 decades.
Sure. I actually started off as an engineer. I didn't start off as a designer, so my education is all in the science. And I remember my very first job at HP. I was doing as geeky things as you could imagine. I was actually writing the Unix operating system. And as I was doing that, I remember asking a question of who's actually using the software we're writing. And I heard a chair drop, and that was the human factors person. That was just like, what, an operating systems engineer asking about customers? And he was thrilled to death. And, a lot of what I've learned about customers and understanding customers came from Paul, who was then the designation was human factors. And he was the HFI person that sort of started me on my journey. And there's honestly been no looking back since. I realized that there is a lot of creativity in writing code and making something work the way you want it to work. But ultimately, really what matters is not how beautiful your code is, but what that code makes, software or solutions, and what that solution actually helps with the customer's life. So it's really about, making a difference and making an impact and creating those awesome experiences. And so I've never really looked back since then. I worked at Merrill after that, where it was a combination role. I did design as well as a little bit of development. And after that, there's been, I've always prided myself in knowing enough about technology to be trouble, but not enough to actually code anymore. But I think it helps me be a good technology designer because I understand technology in an inherent way, and then can take advantage of the capabilities of that technology to then do great things for the customer. So I think, writing code is more the means to the end of providing that great experience for the customers. And to the latter part of my career, I focused more on creating those awesome experiences and not necessarily writing the code that then delivers that awesome experience.
So that's pretty interesting. So as designers, often you're taught to sort of prioritize the customer's needs and think without constraints, right? So having transitioned from being an engineer, knowing the nooks and crannies of how something functions, is that in some way limiting at all, when you think from a designer's perspective?
Actually not. I think the nirvana is a lot of blue sky thinking. But the truth is that there's always constraints that you're working within. It's feasibility, it's time, it's what resources people have. So I think constraints are actually really wonderful. They force you to think innovatively and really allow you to create solutions in spite of those constraints. So constraints are wonderful. But in terms of, did my background inhibit me from, thinking more creatively and thinking more broadly? I don't think so. In fact, design thinking as a process, the thing that we use at Pensaar, is about, first identifying the customer's needs, like what is that unmet need that if solved could make a huge improvement in the customer's life. You start with that. And then once you're able to define the problem statement, you start to focus on how can I solve it? And to do that, you go broad, you try multiple ideas, you color outside the box, across the edges, everything. You go broad, and then you start to focus on narrowing down. So I think design thinking as a methodology allows you to exercise those muscles of going broad to then narrow.
Right.
So no, I don't think it's restrictive at all.
Right. I'm actually reminded of a Steve Jobs quote where he said, design is not just what it looks like and feels like, design is how it works, right? And,
Absolutely.
for a lot of left brain people who are listening to this podcast, I mean, design is a lot about colors and shapes and placement and stuff like that, right? How would you sort of explain this quote to these left brain folks who are listening to it?
Yeah. Actually, I don't look at design as just color and form. There is color and form, but it's not limited to that. And I think that's one of the biggest myths
It's the
that
lowest
people think.
level
Oh,
of abstraction, I would say.
Yeah. And I would say for me, design is a lot more than that. If you think about, it's not just creating easy to use frictionless experiences. Design is first about identifying what is that job that you have to do really, really well, that you have to solve really, really well through your service or your product. You start there. If you're familiar with the jobs to be done
Yeah. I was just thinking
methodology or
about it. Yeah.
framework, yeah, it's about what is that job that the customer is hiring, and I'm using air quotes, you to solve. You want to keep that focus on that. On top of that, you want to layer on ease, frictionless, bring in that intuitiveness. You want to bring in that ease through intuitiveness and frictionless experiences. And then you want to layer on delight, that unexpected delight, something your customers didn't really expect. And that's when you get that true wow experience that changes people's lives so profoundly that they can't imagine going back to the old
Yeah.
way of doing things, right?
Yeah.
So design is not about colors. It's certainly pleasing to use something that is beautiful to look at, intuitive to look at, frictionless. But what's more important is what is that job that it's trying to solve for you? And doing that really well is more important. And then you layer on the other things.
Right. So let's talk about the jobs to be done framework, right? And how you've seen it used. So for people who are listening who may not be familiar, could you just explain that concept a little bit and how you've seen it play out in a few instances?
Sure thing. So, the what we do is we start by understanding. Let's say, for example, let me pick a really drab topic of finance, right? It's something that very few people love, but all of us need to do. We need to manage our finances, right? Our money in and our money out. So, in order to manage our finances and survive every day and make our money in, money out work, what are the various things that each individual does in order to satisfy their goals and their desires in life? So there could be multiple things a person is doing. For example, you're working so that you can get some money in. You might be investing. You're investing. So again, there's a revenue source that comes in. What do you do with your money? Maybe some of us put it off for the future. Some of us blow it out. Some of us, look at it as a way to enjoy a certain quality of life. So these are all jobs that a person is doing. And they could be hiring, let's say, a personal finance product to do that. Another job could be, make sure that I make my money in, money out work so that there is something left over for me to invest in the future. Maybe it is, hey, help me control my spending. And that could be a budget tool. So each of these jobs are things that individuals desire to help accomplish. And what we do is we start by truly, observing what customers do and not just listening to what they tell us. Because a lot of times when you ask people, they tell you what they intend to do versus
Yeah.
what they really do. So our research methodology allows us to do a lot of observation, show me how type things, where we identify what are the most important jobs and how are they doing it today and the emotion that they feel when they do it. There are lots of, for example, bank applications that say, hey, this is my savings account, put this money away, but are they truly using it like a savings account? What is that money going towards? Those are the types of things we try to understand during research. And then there is the framework that everyone can Google and find out, which is what are the jobs, what are the high-level jobs, what are the needs, and how do people measure success? And that's what's key, that you understand. It's actually very, very logical if you think about it, right?
Yeah.
And yet, so many startup founders go about solving a problem that they can't articulate. We're talking about number of downloads and this and that, but we're not talking about what is the problem we're solving for our customers, and how well is it meeting that need to actively measure it. So, the Jobs to be Done framework allows you to sort of put everything in perspective to say, who are you solving the problem for? What is the problem you're solving? And what are their various needs?
Right. This episode is brought to you by Mulya. You want to move fast? Sure. But without breaking things? Now that's a hard ask. The thing is, once you have some base of users and customers, you just cannot afford to risk quality. So how do the likes of Cred, Swiggy and CureFit, some of India's fastest growing startups, ship at lightning pace and delight their users and customers? Simple, they're working with Mulya as a strategic quality partner. Mulya is India's most talented and passionate community of testers. They've helped prevent thousands of bugs and regression issues. So as a CTO or a product owner, if you want to reduce tech debt, especially while you scale, do check out mulya.com. I've interviewed Mulya's founder and CEO Pradeep on the podcast earlier, and we spoke about how startups can improve quality while scaling and things to that effect. You should definitely check it out. I'll link to it in the description below. Now back to your regular programming. Right. So user research seems like one of those very fundamental things that everyone should be doing, but nobody really understands how to do it in the most productive manner, right? I think, and it's a hard thing as well. I mean, I think this is David Ogilvy quote that says, the problem with market research is that people don't say what they think and they don't do what they say, right? So, I wonder if you have some hacks or tips for people who are listening on how to effectively translate user research into actionable insights that could actually help with product development and so on.
Yeah, I think there's actually two parts to it. There's one, how do you do research? And the second thing is, how do you then make it actionable, the research that you've in fact done? And I'll answer it in two parts, if that's okay with you. The first part about how do you do research? A lot of folks will just say, hey, I know my uncle does this or my aunt does this, or they know somebody that does it, and they start to step into that person's shoes. There's an old Indian adage that goes, to step into someone else's shoes, you've got to take yours off first. And what happens is we have a lot of unconscious biases, and we've got to stay curious. We've got to really think about observing, seeing what they're actually doing, asking curious questions, and really trying to dig into the why someone is doing what they are. And that's when you can go from that state of unconscious bias to a state of conscious understanding, where, I understand what you do, as illogical and as irrational as some of the things might be that customers do. You don't judge, you understand. And that's like the true place of being empathetic. There are a lot of tools that help you do that. And we've got some tools and tips that we've got on our website. So I'm happy to share a link with you. And folks can go in and take a look at specific tools and techniques to do that. So that's the part of, research itself. And then there's the so what, right? Now I've done research. I've talked to 5 different people, and the 5 different people are telling me 5 different things. What should I focus on? That part, the synthesis becomes really important. And again, that synthesis you can do as simple as, a journey line, right? We all know what a journey line is. You have a start, you have a finish, and you've got a journey through it. Identifying what people's journey is. When are they really happy? When are they really sad? When are they frustrated? When are they worried? Looking at all of those emotions through each individual, and then identifying gaps, opportunities, pain points. That's how you synthesize it. It's not that, okay, you know what, Deepa did this, so we need to put this feature like this. It's about, why did Deepa do this? What was there an opportunity there? And what is that? So you've got to keep asking yourself those why questions and look for patterns and trends. And then you can get into, okay, here is an insight. And this insight will now inspire the innovation or the features or the functionality that I would then put into play. And I know I say features and functionality a lot as if it's always a technology solution, but it can be anything. It can be a physical product, it can be a service, it could be a restaurant experience. It really could be any of those things.
Right. So a lot of the things that you're talking about is design at a very fundamental level of problem solving, right? And oftentimes, maybe it's changing, but then, oftentimes design gets involved at almost as an afterthought when with startups, especially, right? I mean, they think of it still as a little bit of a luxury. You have a very basic, shitty MVP out there in the market, and then, you think that you can add something to it afterwards. How do you get founders and startups to prioritize design at the very initial stages of product development?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And and that's why when you said design is about making things a color and visual, and that's why I had the reaction I did, which is you can't just pretty things up with design. Design, you had several quotes from Steve Jobs as well that you talked about. Design is just not about pretty pictures. It goes so much deeper into really understanding, like I said, solving the need, then layering on ease, and then layering on delight. And all of that entire thing is design. So when we talk to, honestly, we do a lot of pro bono work with startups. They simply can't afford us. So we do a lot of pro bono work. And when I remember working with an accelerator that had a bunch of startups. And the first thing I asked, me and a few of us from Pensar went in. And the first thing we asked was, can you help define who the problem is for? What are they trying to do? When they're trying to do that, what is the problem? Why does that problem exist? And how does it make them feel? It's a simple problem statement, right? We started with asking them to write that. And I'll tell you, it was super surprising that a very, very small percentage was able to articulate that for us. And when we went around and we asked people, we said, hey, can you show us the problem statement? They'd be like, can I show you my solution? Can I tell you about my service? So what happens, and this every entrepreneur has to watch out for, is you fall in love with your solution. You have to actually fall in love with the problem, not your solution.
Great point.
If you fall in love with your solution, you're not going to read the tea leaves. You're not going to see the reasons why people wouldn't use your product. But if you're maniacally obsessed about the problem, then you will know that your solution is just a way to solve the problem, and you're going to try to be the best you can possibly be. Now, obviously, things like design thinking and what I'm sharing with you doesn't guarantee success. Nothing does. But what it does is it ups your chances of success, right? Being thoughtful and methodical about what is the problem you're trying to solve. Being maniacally obsessed with the problem and not your solution. And then going about it. So, a large part of what we do is that awareness of, you really need to be thoughtful about what is the problem you're solving. The second thing we do is look at metrics. Now, luckily, every startup is looking at metrics. Whether they're good metrics or bad metrics, they're looking at metrics, which is a good thing. They're measuring stuff. What we ask them to look at something called customer benefit metrics, right? Which is what the reason why your customers will choose you over competition. That's a customer benefit, right? So for example, we all use multiple e-commerce solutions to buy our products. but several of us, gravitate towards one. Why do we do that? There are some benefits that particular e-commerce platform is solving for us, which others are not doing as well. That's your customer benefit metric. So you've got to be able to determine success and articulate success in customer terms. So problem statement, customer benefit metrics. That's what's important. If you have that, again, like I said, it doesn't guarantee you success, but it certainly ups your chances of success.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it hedges all sorts of risks, right? I mean, maybe the problem you're solving is not a problem in the first place. Maybe, I mean, there is a different solution for that problem, etc. But if you do go through that process, for sure, right? I mean, you don't have to second guess. Let's talk about metrics, right? So what are some typical metrics that you would suggest designers and founders have to be aware of? I know that NPS is a favorite with people. It also hides a wide variety of sins, right? It's very difficult to double down on things, and it's that David Ogilvy quote again, right? So what would you advise?
Yeah, I think NPS is rough because it's a lagging metric, right?
Correct.
You can't test NPS in your first few days of execution. You can't test NPS when you're prototyping and showing people concepts. So I go back to customer benefit metrics. Go back to those metrics and say, hey, if we did this, do you think this would happen? And identify what would be leading indicators to that lagging indicator of NPS or other customer benefit metrics you have. There's actually, HBR has this, I think it's called elements of something. It's an elements of a pyramid or elements of value, I believe it is. Sorry about that. Elements of value, I believe it is, where you start with measuring functional parameters, then you move to emotional parameters, then you talk about life-changing parameters, and then, of course, the highest level is social impact, right? You're changing the world and changing the way people are. So the functional metrics are usually in 3 dimensions. You're either saving people time, or you're saving or making money, or you're reducing the frequency of a bad event happening or increasing a frequency of a good event happening. The functional parameters are just along these 3 dimensionals: time, money, frequency, right? You then move to the emotional parameters. Does this help reduce anxiety? Does this improve your happiness? Does it make you feel more safe and secure? And then, you sort of go on and on with the life. And so you have to actively measure both functional and emotional. And there are ways to do all of them, including but not limited to qualitative interviews.
Right. So one of the things at any fast-growing startup is that they have really, an infinite number of tasks and they have to prioritize, right? And founders often tend to prioritize the things that are some proxy of revenue as such. So which is why, design also kind of lags behind, right? So what would you say to, founders to get sort of design more prioritized in the fundamental stages of product development itself? That is one. And second, often we find designers reporting to product folks, right? Is that a fair structure, or do you think that design should be hived off as a separate function by itself?
Yeah, there's a lot of thought with several design leaders about designing design in an organization. What is the right sort of ratio of designers to engineers, designers to product managers? Which table do they have a seat at?
Yeah.
But I don't know, I think there's no hard and fast rule for things like that. I've worked in organizations, and with Pensaar, we have this variety of clients that we work with where, some engineers are really astute about design. And there you can get away with having a lower ratio of engineers to designers. And then there are ones where, people don't even know who uses their product. They only know about their piece of code that they're writing. there you need maybe a lot of education and evangelization plus a higher ratio of designers. So I don't know that there's any hard and fast rule, but having the right seat at the table early on in the product, or even, for example, one of our clients, Flipkart, brought us in fairly later through the sort of the development cycle. But we were still able to reimagine the products. Again, we started with, understanding customers. What is that deep insight that we now know? The earlier, the better you involve design. But even when you do it much later on, there's so much value provided you don't just color the boxes differently, but that you actually start with understanding what is the need your service or product is solving and focus on that. And then you'll see great things happen.
Right.
We've seen, and we actively measure so that people can see the difference that it makes when you focus on understanding customers and when you use that understanding to create insights and use those insights to then inspire your solution or your service.
Right.
That's when it truly works. So I would say it doesn't matter where they sit in the organization, and there's no hard and fast rule, in my opinion. It depends on which organization and what the culture of the organization is. And in terms of, the number of things that are busy and important, and startups have to focus on several aspects. My one question is this: if you focus on design as a lever to growth, to business growth, then why would you not want to do it? If you're bringing in design just to beautify things, then don't do it at all, because the improvement you'll see is possibly marginal. If you have a great product that's already solving the needs, and then you're focusing on ease, which is making it frictionless, making it more intuitive, you will see that change and you'll be able to measure that growth.
Right.
So it's not only for startup founders, but also to my fellow designers to say, hey, you know what? Stop focusing on just the beautification of things. Look at how the product works and make that better fundamentally, while you improve the intuitiveness and the frictionless of the product.
Right. I have a pet theory that actually designers can replace product managers, right? I mean, I'm going to get a lot of flack for this, but I think that, product managers get thrown in the mix because they can translate business requirements to engineers, and, and also, I mean, they can get a seat at the table for designers, right? I mean, to get the designer's opinion across to leadership and so on and so forth. What can designers do to sort of be taken more seriously by business leaders and by startup, founders and so on?
First off, I think I have a different view from you on the role of a product manager itself. I've run product managers as well as, product management teams as well as design teams. And I think that there is an overlap. But
I gave a very crude, sort of a representation. I'm sure that there are fantastic product managers out there. And if they're listening, well, no offense to any one of you.
No, I think product managers play a very important role, right? You look at, if I can think about models to best represent it, you want to be working at the intersection of desirability, marketability, and feasibility, right? The intersection, if you look at it as a Venn diagram, the intersection of those three is where you want your solutions or your services to be in. So the desirability gets best represented by the designer or the researcher that understands the customers. Now, it's not to say that on teams, it's only the designer's role to understand customers. In fact, it's everybody's job to understand the customer. Then there's the marketability. Can I sell this? Which, of course, marketeers and product managers have a large role to play in that. And then there's the feasibility, where engineers come in to say what is doable and what isn't. So I think there's that, what we call the tripod of design, product management, and engineering that forms this really nice, when it's done well, it can be a high performing team. when the product manager knows enough about the feasibility to be intelligent, when the engineer knows enough about the customer to be thoughtful about the trade-offs that they make in their code, when the designer knows enough about the business aspects of what makes the product tick and work in the business environment, that's when it's a high-performing organization. So I would say, it's how these functions come together to cohesively do the job versus one or the other.
Right. So, again, what are some ways designers should interact with these overlapping functions? So what should the designers do, for instance, when, the product manager comes up with, a mile-long feature list, or let's say an engineer says, totally blocks the guy off, saying that, hey, no, this is not possible at all.
Right.
So
absolutely. So can I answer those questions with stories?
Sure. Absolutely, please.
So I remember as a young designer, a really, really young designer, I was, I'll keep out the name of the company and such, but as a young designer, I was in a business meeting where people that were way above my pay grade were deciding the destiny of the product that I was the designer for. And they were looking to sunset the product. And we were discussing it, and like I said, way above my pay grade. And the discussions were going on. They almost made the decision. And I said, hey, I have an input to give you guys. And I started talking about real customer stories. And I started talking about the need, the competition. And that found me a seat at the table, right? Because I had that deep customer empathy, but I didn't stop there. I also knew the business context. What was the competition like? Is it possible to make money? What are some strategies we should put in play? That actually helps and gets you a seat at the table. So my sort of shout out to all the designers would be to build that customer empathy themselves, whether the organization is asking them to do it or not, to take the time, make the time to deeply empathize and build that customer empathy so you can help evangelize the customer. I look at the designer's role as being the customer advocate in the organization, to truly communicate who your customers are, what is the product helping them solve, bring those customer stories to life. That's what's really important. And I forgot the second part of your question.
Basically, I think you've answered that question, which is, I think essentially what you're saying is bring data to the table, right? Bring some actual hard data to the table, because I think there's that quote by, I think it was the CEO of Netscape, Netscape, I think. It says something like, if we have data, we look at data. If all we have is our opinions, then we'll go with mine, right?
Yeah.
So, I think, so that's really what happens. I mean, this sort of a tussle between design and product, or design and engineering, right? So I think as long as people bring data to the table, then I would say it's skew more towards, more towards the best decision getting made, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's actually a tool that people should go look up. It's called FOG, right? And pun intended. There's no one knows, right? And you just assume. So F stands for facts, O is for opinion, and G is for guess. And so you write down, and we do this when we do workshops with our clients, right? So we say, hey, what do we know about the customer? Let's start to write them down. And we ask them to start, grouping it in facts, opinions, and guesses. And then we go talk to customers. And then you'll see the post-its start to move. What people are convinced to be true and they say is a fact, they realize was just an opinion or a guess.
Yeah.
So the process of getting data, not just through research, but with technology and instrumentation, there's a lot of observational data we have in the product itself. How many people took the certain path? How many people stopped or paused in one area or the other? And those are all facts that you have. And like you said, you want to be able to have data-driven decisions that you make.
Yeah.
And so that becomes really important. And there's also rapid experimentation where, it's not about, do I like this or does someone else like it? And when I used to run design teams, it used to bother me so much when people would do usability studies and say 90% of the people said something when they've only talked to like 10 people, right? So, I believe it's really important to run rapid experiments to say, okay, you know what, you think this will work, you have a particular assumption, test it out. Smoke and mirrors, doesn't matter what you have to put in play to test it out, but test it out and see what happens, and then
Right.
make those data backed decisions.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very important point, because I think we often overestimate quantitative parameters and underestimate qualitative parameters, right? So I think just having these stories and anecdotes from actual customers and users can go a long way in, kind of aligning your product with the customer or user expectations.
Mhm.
We've spoken a lot about customer centricity, about customer obsession, and things to that effect, right? What is your advice in sort of building a culture of customer obsession within the startup?
Yeah. I've seen organizations do it multiple ways. One is, I think it requires the help. It's not one of those things where you say, hey, we're all customer centric. We know the customer. And without rigor, you run around and sort of do what you think is right by the customer. I think there are professionals like us, but not only limited to us, where you want to get that help. You want to bring people in that can help you sort of organize your customer obsession in a way that is meaningful. Um, I worked for a company that said, every individual is going to go talk to two customers. And they went and talked to two customers, they came back, and life was as usual. So, you can't just force empathy a certain way. Our experience at Pensar has led us to believe that, there's a lot of unlearning to do because we're all experienced professionals that have a certain way of doing things. There's a little bit of unlearning to do, there's some learning to do, but more importantly, application of that learning itself. And sometimes it's the little things, right? Someone that we worked with, he says, this is the question I ask based on, remember I was talking about go broad to try multiple ideas before you narrow down.
Yeah.
Human beings, and especially engineers, are genetically engineered to solve problems. So you see a problem, right away you have a solution, and then you run with it, right? So one of the key things about design thinking is to go broad and try multiple ideas before you narrow down to one. So the one question this manager would ask at every project review was, this is a great idea to solve this problem. What else did you try? 9 times out of 10, his teams were looking at the floor because that was the only idea that they came up with and they ran with it,
Yeah.
right? So it's the little things that you can do in the organization. I was giving you the example about the problem, right? Identifying the problem first. So every project review, start with identifying the problem. We've got a bunch of features and solutions, but what was the problem we were trying to solve? And it doesn't have to be only on new products, even with existing products, right? So start with the problem, look at multiple solutions before you narrow down to one, and then have the humility to test
Right.
and measure, right? So those would be the small things people can start to do. But to really change the culture of an organization, it's a journey, it's a transformation. So you've got to give it the discipline and the rigor that it requires. You get the help, to organize yourself. You start small, and then, you evangelize the process in your
Yeah.
organization.
Yeah. So I think, in my experience as well, it's a very intrinsic thing, right? I mean, it's a very top-down thing as well. I mean, it's something that has to be driven by the CEOs, driven by leaders as such. You mentor a lot of startups, right?
Yes.
You're associated with a few accelerators and so on and so forth. what are some common design related challenges that you see at startups, aside from the fact that, designers could be an afterthought for all of the reasons we discussed and so on. So what are some other problems and how can they address them?
Yeah. I would say completely, there are two main things that I think people struggle with. One is not identifying the problem, which we've already talked about. And the second is, of all the things they're measuring as a company, which, like I said, it's very encouraging that everyone is measuring. What percentage of those measures are actually customer metrics? And very few folks are actually measuring the things that we talked about, like the functional improvement, the emotional improvement. People are looking at what we like to call as vanity metrics, which is number of downloads. It doesn't matter how many people have downloaded your product. What actually matters is active use, right? MAU, DAU, those are metrics that actually matter. So I would say, like at a high level, those are the two problems. And not the third is probably not having the humility to test with customers, like feeling like you will know it all. Going with your gut, making those large assumptions and taking unnecessarily high risks.
Like being Steve Jobs without being Steve Jobs.
I know, right? For Steve Jobs, it's fine.
Yeah.
But for the rest of us.
But there's everyone else, right?
Exactly right. So for the
So
rest of us, we've got to have that rigor and that discipline to say, what are the assumptions we're making? What are the assumptions that we're making if which not held true, the entire idea falls flat on its face? Those are the assumptions we should definitely have the humility to test.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I remember speaking to someone on the podcast, early on, and one of the things that he said just kind of stuck with me. It's like part of the thing that you're doing also is uncovering a lot of uncomfortable truths, so you can kind of deal with them, right? And that comes really by being, customer focused, user focused, and really listening to it and testing everything that you do, right, or everything that you think you should do. So let's talk about a couple of. I have a couple of questions with respect to designers, right? We're gonna
Sorry,
lift
if I could just interrupt you. I don't think you test everything.
Right.
It's not possible to test everything, right?
Right.
I think the assumptions which you test are, those big assumptions that you're making,
right,
which if not held true, your entire idea falls flat on its face. Those are the ones you want to rapidly experiment.
Right.
The rest, you can take your experience, you can maybe take some risks, but you want to mitigate risks by looking at those big assumptions first.
Right. Yeah, that's a fair point. Couple of questions with respect to designers itself, right? We're all going to probably live to 80 or 100, and which means, probably 5 or even 6 decades of work life, right? How should designers listening to this podcast sort of plan their career for the next 3 or 4 decades, and how can they be relevant?
Yeah. Fabulous question. I think every designer, regardless of whether they're a visual designer, a communications designer, doesn't matter what type of designer they are, they need to get ethnographic skills. So at Pensar, every one of us can do user research, every one of us, and do them well. And that, I think, is a mandatory skill that every designer should learn, regardless of whether they do product design, service design, UI, UX, doesn't really matter. That, I think, is fundamental and a necessary foundation for every designer.
Right.
Now, having said that, no one person can be great at multiple things, right? I feel like you need to get your skills at least at the fundamental level. You need to be able to build empathy and truly, truly understand customers better than they know themselves. That's what it is to build true empathy. Then really figure out what you're naturally good at, right? Are you good at conceptual thinking? Are you good at details and workflow? Are you good at visuals? Are you good at communication? Are you good at like product design? And then start to layer on the other skills. Don't start with, I can do communication design. Yes, but who are you doing that communication design for? Do you understand the needs? That becomes really fundamental and foundational for any designer.
Right.
Second thing I would say is, again, a quick story. I remember as a young designer feeling super proud of the design I came up with and putting it up on the, the review and feeling attacked because everybody has an opinion, right?
Yeah.
And design is that type of function where you've got to have a thick skin to understand what that feedback is and have the ability to sort of moderate the feedback in a way that is actionable. So there's a quick tool that we use called plus delta, right? So we start with, hey, what works? Let's list those things out. Then let's look at things that are not working and then identifying it so that it's a balanced view. You've got to be great moderators to be able to, one, understand customers, two, be able to get the feedback from multiple people and understand why. So I don't feel like your ethnographic skills stop with understanding customers. You were also talking about, if an engineer then finally says, hey, this design is not feasible, it's DOA, right? So how do you work with an engineer to truly understand what works? So, a lot of times, and, going back to the story of me as a young designer, I felt attacked and I couldn't take that feedback. So I think as designers, we need to be able to process that feedback. Just like we're open to processing the feedback from customers, we should be open to processing that feedback from all of the stakeholders that we work with, right? So it also means that another foundational skill you need is that of facilitation or moderation, so that you can actually get what's really important versus the noise. If people don't like a particular color, it's all right, right? But if there is something functionally wrong with it, you want to understand so that your design can be implemented well and will be implemented well. So I would say those are things that are not necessarily taught in design school, but are very important as you work in the industry. And that's what sort of differentiates a good designer from a great designer, because they're able to build that empathy even with the teams that they're working with.
Right. Wow, that's fantastic. Because I had a follow-up question on, what are some non-technical skills that designers should know? And seeing as you've mentioned a bunch of them in my previous on my previous question, I think, yeah. So why is that though? I mean, when you talk about future readiness and stuff like that, right? People immediately jump to technologies or certifications or things to that effect. But then you're talking about a lot of higher order thinking and a lot of behavioral skills, right? Which is amazing, and those are extremely important, as you mentioned. How can designers graduate to become great design leaders and manage teams as such? Now, I know from experience that managing creative people is just well, you know what it is, right? So so it's just a harrowing job, because everyone is so, they have their own unique perspective, and it's very difficult to moderate these opinions and so on and so forth. But what are some tips that you would have for designers who are listening to this, who might want to graduate to design managers and design leaders at some point of time?
Yeah. So I think a large part of every designer's job is to evangelize design in their organization and in the environment in which they work. So the better you can get with not like, oh, why should I have to rationalize what I do? Think of it as an education process. Think of it as an evangelization process, and go ahead and start doing it. It becomes really, really important to evangelize design. We were talking earlier about how ethnographic skills are important, which is, your ability to empathize and truly build your skills to get to that level. Facilitation skills. And the other one is this, which is how can you really evangelize what you do?
Hmm.
We have to invest in order for people to understand the value. And there are a lot of things that you can't be like, oh, they should just know. It's not like engineers have to evangelize what they do.
Right.
It is, it is a function that came much later than engineering, and so we have to catch up. So rather than be belligerent about it, embrace it and evangelize it. I think to be a good design leader, you have to be a good business leader, right? And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, about measuring design and having the skills to measure the design and not say things like, you know it when you see it, and stuff like that. It's like, what? There are some things like delight and such, which, unexpected delight, which is very hard to measure. But that's because it's on the top of the pyramid. The bottom ones you can very easily measure. So I would say be a good business partner, because at the end of the day, everyone's role at a company is to help the company grow. So aligning yourself to not just blue sky thinking and saying, I'm going to define the future, but you're going to define the future of the company. So to ground yourself in the business is really important as a design leader. And I would say, I've honestly not had challenges working with creative people. That's possibly because I'm one myself. But I do think that it's not just right brain thinking. It's about where the two come together, right? That happy middle, that overlap between the logical thinking and the creative thinking. And that's where design thinking lies, at that intersection. And so I would say being a leader is using all of your skills as a designer, being empathetic, being a good listener, but also helping facilitate towards action and not constant debate and discussion. It's about, getting to a place that's important. And any creative person that tells you, oh, creatives take time, it's not possible to just make it work, you can't believe that. You just simply can't believe that.
Right.
There's a lot of creativity in writing code as well. But it's not like an engineer will come to you and say, today I'm having a bad day, I just can't think of the solution, right? So it's about not dealing with that BS, right? And saying, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to figure out how you're going to do this in the time it will. Now, yes, an additional day helps, but also being a prima donna and saying, oh, it can't be done, I don't feel good, that's unnecessary, I think.
Right. Yeah, and I think, would it be a fair comment to say that designers are more susceptible to that sort of thinking, the prima donna, the artist, the brooding, intellectual sort of general vibe that they have?
Well, usually designers are the black turtleneck, glasses, if you're a guy, skinhead. I mean, they're the stereotypes, right?
Yeah, sure.
But I honestly don't think that I've managed engineering teams as well, and large engineering teams. And I think there's just as many brooding engineers and architects as there are designers.
Right.
So I feel like that's probably stereotyping individuals. And it's
Sure.
also about the environment you create. Just this morning, I was talking about time being a really good constraint for us to be on our toes, testing, having the humility to test with customers constantly, right? There are times where any function can use that additional time to get better quality. And design is no exception to that.
Sure. So, one of the last questions I want to ask you is about the current times that we're living in. How important is design and customer thinking, customer obsession, customer centricity in a post-COVID world? What would your advice be to founders, operators, designers who are listening to this podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I think to embrace the change that, or the opportunity that COVID has allowed, right? Look at the number of things that have changed because of COVID, right? Um, e- like people are talking about Zoom meetings, people that I would have never imagined,
Right.
that they would be even saying Zoom or know what a virtual meeting is. Um, there's a lot of other market changes as well, thanks to the really large, network provider. Your Bharat or India too has access to internet connectivity in ways that you couldn't have imagined. And probably India's leapfrogged several countries in that.
Absolutely.
Um, so the other thing that COVID has, I guess, brought about is your need for entertainment. More people are live streaming content than ever before. So I think there are a lot of changes, and I think there's a saying, because you've been quoting people. I don't know who made this quote, but they say, "Don't waste a pandemic," or "Don't
Yeah.
waste,
Don't waste a crisis.
or
Yeah.
don't waste a crisis." There you go. So I think there is this crisis has helped us, maybe push through things that would have taken a much longer time. So it's about embracing that and understanding that and seeing how you could use that to your advantage to better the customer benefits for your customers.
Right. Okay. Before we let you go, one
Yeah.
final question to you. Any books or podcasts that you would recommend?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think I'm a big fan of behavioral economics to understand, why people do what they do, seemingly irrational things, why they do what they do. I'm a big fan of Dan Ariely. So certainly recommend any or all of his books and his podcasts. Um, in terms of having the humility to experiment, Eric Ries, I mean, he is
Yeah.
amazing. Lean
Lean
Startup,
Startup.
really, really good books to look and adopt, not just read. And then, yeah, check our tools out as well. We share
Sure.
very generously. So on Pensaar Design, you'll find a bunch of tools, and we do practice what we preach. We evangelize a lot. So we've got a design thinking summit coming up, which is fully free, um, and we teach out of the love of sharing what we know about design thinking. So
Fantastic.
yeah, do check
Yeah.
us out.
We'll definitely link to the website and any workshops or training sessions that you have coming up.
Sure.
Deepa, this has been a fascinating conversation. I got to
Thank
learn a
you.
lot more about design and how designers should work, how we should work with designers, and plenty of other things. Thank you so much for this conversation. Thank
My
you for your
pleasure.
time.
My pleasure, man. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode, then don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite platform and share this episode with all of your fellow startup operators. Also, follow the Startup Operator on LinkedIn and Twitter for more updates. Stay safe, take care, and see you soon on a brand new episode of the Startup Operator.